Hi everyone, just going to let the participants sort of file in through the Zoom waiting room and then we can kick off in a minute. Okay, so the stream of entrants seems to have slowed down, and I would like to make sure we give our panelists lots of time to talk and answer questions. I'm Becs Kirk, I'm a publisher at PLOS, and I want to thank you all for joining us for what I know is going to be an incredibly interesting session. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications, or C4DISC. The mission of C4DISC is to work with organisations and individuals to build equity, inclusion, diversity and accessibility in scholarly communications. The Society for Scholarly Publishing is a founding member of C4DISC, and its Diversity, Equity, Inclusion and Accessibility Committee has organised and produced our webinar today, with special thanks to Steph Pollock from APA and Megan McCarthy from J&J Editorial. We have a really great lineup of speakers today, and I want to thank them all in advance for sharing their experiences and expertise with us. First up, we will have Holly Falk-Krzesinski from Elsevier. She has had a pivotal role in the multi-publisher Joint Commitment for Action in Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing group in the development of a global framework to consistently collect gender identity and race and ethnicity data across scholarly communication and editorial workflow platforms. Following her, we will have Alex Mendonça from SciELO, where he is overseeing the development of the SciELO preprint server, promoting the adoption of open data and making the peer review process more transparent and open. He's also overseeing the implementation of DEIA policies, both inside and outside SciELO and its index journals. And finally, wrapping up, we have Dan Rogers from Oxford University Press, where he serves as the co-lead of AUP's US D&I committee and has been implementing demographic data collection using survey instruments and manages the Oxford Bibliography's editorial programme. So first up, I just need to quickly cover some housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared out. Please do add your questions for the panellists in the Q&A box at the bottom. We will have time for a panel discussion following all the speakers' presentations. As noted already, the chat box can be used to discuss topics raised in the webinar, and please do introduce yourselves. I do want to make you all aware of the C4DISC Code of Conduct. It's devised to create a harassment-free community for everybody. The expectation is that we all engage with positive intent, with respect for the panelists and all of the participants. A final item before we kick off, C4DISC is seeking volunteers at the moment. If we could have the next slide, please, to help manage a virtual space for peer learning around DEIA and scholarly communications. This is for those with a dedicated DEIA role or with a DEIA remit as part of their role. So whether that's in paid or volunteer capacity. I'll add a link to the chat for those interested to learn more shortly. Just before I pass over to Holly, I wanted to ask for all of your input to find out sort of where you all are in this journey at the moment, where you're coming from. So we have a couple of polls that we want to kick off with. The first poll here is, what's your current level of engagement with collecting and using demographic data? This is speaking for your organisation. So we're thinking, do you already collect this data and actually use it to inform your efforts? Do you collect data but haven't used it for DEIA efforts yet? You have plans to integrate this data in the future, or you're just here to learn sort of at the beginning of that journey? So if you could just click one of those and we'll share the information when we have some responses. That's a really interesting spread. So pretty much the vast majority, 75%, have some plans or are already using this data. But it's really great to see that there are people here who are like at the start of that journey and can really benefit from the expertise of the panelists. I just have another question. This probably hopefully is a bit quicker. What peer review system are you using? So what manuscript tracking system are you using? We've put Editorial Manager, ScholarOne, Research Exchange and other as the options. If you're using something else, it would be interesting to capture that in the chat if possible. just to get an idea of what we're all using. EJP. Yeah, we forgot about that one. I spent many years using that. That should have been imprinted on my mind. Okay, so let's see how we're going. Decent proportion using EM, and yeah, I'm curious how many of the other is EJP, possibly you. Okay, thank you all for engaging with that. That was really useful information to kick off with. I'm now going to pass over to Holly to really kick off the presentation proper.
All right, give me just a moment here. I think everybody is able to see. Are we good? Someone just holler out if you're able to see. Okay, good. Just making sure. All right, it is my pleasure to kick things off, and I'm delighted to have been invited today. I'm going to start by talking about joint commitment for action on inclusion and diversity in publishing, aka the Joint Commitment Collective. This is a group now of 56 publishers, originally convened by the Royal Society of Chemistry, and we will forever be grateful to RSC for the convening. And I'm going to talk first about the approach that we took as a collective to developing bespoke schemas for gender identity, ethnic origins, and race, specifically for the capture of self-reported data within systems such as EJ Press and Scholar One and Editorial Manager and the others. Then I'm going to end and tell you Elsevier began implementing the joint commitment endorsed schemas only a couple of months after the endorsement came through. That happened in April. In June, well, really early July, Elsevier started implementing, and I have some initial data to be able to share with you. So I probably don't need for this group to say, but just remembering that there is an importance to the data, so that we are not making assumptions, we're not making inferences, that the data is important because it helps to overcome biases, because there's a lot of misperception. And I think this is where publishers add such considerable value with regards to thinking about DEI, because we have ways of collecting and using data, either as large-scale scienceometric studies, and then the analysis of self-reported user data, which is what all of us will be focusing on today. As the Joint Commitment Group was thinking about how to do this, of course, there were the data schemas that we needed to develop, but we also recognized that there were no fewer than 3 major platforms and many others that different publishers were using, some publishers even using more than one. That the communication with all of our stakeholders internally and externally was going to be important, and then how it is that we were going to be doing reporting and using this data. This is the first schema that the Joint Commitment endorsed. It's the gender identity data field. And you'll note some things. We're more specific than just saying gender. We're actually asking about gender identity. We ask an specific question. In this case, we ask people to select only one option. We moved away from using terms that generally refer to sex rather than gender identity. And we moved away from only having binary options, which many of our organizations were using. This is a legacy in the way that gender and sex data had previously been, but this is more aligned with most effective processes to date. And then recognizing that this data, and then you'll see for race and ethnicity, is either personal or sensitive personal data per GDPR, ensuring that we're not in violation and that we're invoking the appropriate exceptions for being able to ask respondents to answer these questions with appropriate linkage to then policy information, privacy policy. The gender identity went fairly smoothly, and then we decided that we would extend this effort to race and ethnicity, which was not as smooth. And that's because there were considerable additional complexities, everything from race and ethnicity schema variability across the globe to the new legal and policy considerations because it is sensitive personal data, that we also in early conversations recognize that there is greater sensitivity for respondents about these questions relative to gender. So we brought in an external global census expert, subject matter expert, Professor Ann Morning from New York. So she was a paid consultant through Elsevier, but a resource then for the whole joint commitment group, and then used input from her. Important, I like to point out these guiding principles that we had because they carry through then all the way to when we're using the data. That our intention within the joint commitment was not to define a single objective or prescriptive truth around race and ethnicity, but a set of options that resonate with stakeholders and a scale of diversity that we can practically accommodate, and never capturing data that we don't intend to be able to use in terms of actionable output. We tested the schema, and I'm not going to go over the details of the next slides I'm going to show you. I'm going to give you a high-level overview, but the slides will be made available that you can dive in, and happy to speak to anybody afterwards about the details. But we did do testing, that we tested the draft ethnic origins and race questions about people's representativeness and about their comfort of sharing this data in situ within editorial management systems. I just want to call attention all the way over here on the right-hand side, what I've highlighted. We had a really high rate of self-identification and largely positive feedback during the testing stage. 94% of people selected an option other than other or prefer not to disclose, which we consider non-disclosure for ethnic origins, and then slightly lower, but still very high for race. We asked about the comfort levels, and I want to call attention to the highlighted data over here. Roughly 30%, so 28 to 32%, depending on role, said that they may actually feel uncomfortable with reporting their data. So that's really important information to keep in mind when I show you what happened in real life and when things started happening. At the end of this testing, we identified also that communication is going to be a key consideration in bringing in our external stakeholders, getting their buy-in to share this data with us, their publishers. So I want to just show you, in the URL is listed here, but we developed an incredibly comprehensive FAQ page from Elsevier that touched on everything from legal to privacy to how the questions were developed, and why we're asking them and how we intend to use the data. And just for those of you who are just starting out this process, we went through and worked with both legal and our data privacy officer at Elsevier, and then also at Elsevier's parent company, Relics. We needed to work with the DPO and legal teams there as well. Okay, so we ended up with 3 schemas, and the testing was wildly productive. And in April of last year, there was an endorsement of all 3 schemas. Elsevier then began to implement those across our journals starting in very late June of last year. And here are the 3 what we call diversity questions, or the endorsed gender identity and race and ethnicity schemas. You can see that there are 3 of them. What is the actual topical area? What is the actual question that's being asked? And then all of the options that were presented and are consistently for those who are using the joint commitment endorsed schemas. For Elsevier, we've managed to introduce those into all of our owned and controlled journals, including Cell Press and Lancet portfolio of journals, which amounts to a little over 1,700 journals. As of 1 week ago, we have had 3.1 million responses to each question. With this rollout now complete for Elsevier owned journals, we are now in the process of rolling out these diversity data questions for any and all of our society partners who would like to have that done. We will be able to release the rollout beginning in Q2, and we anticipate that it'll be done by the end of Q2. Interestingly, and I'll show you this, is even though we worked very hard and the feedback that we got, and then the opportunity to communicate back with stakeholders, is that they wanted to be able to select multiple options for both ethnicity and race. And we enabled that and clearly communicated it. But a very small number are actually choosing multiple options or the self-described. Most are actually finding a primary option across all 3 questions. And this I'm going to show you in the data of it. Okay, so as of a couple of weeks ago, as I said, sorry, misreported, 3.5 million researchers have now answered the question. Last month's data was 3.1. So you can see overall, there's slight variation between the three questions because as we roll them out, it's actually happening real time. And the very first group, which was a pilot, only included the gender identity question, was to make sure we didn't break EM. So we always have slightly higher responses for gender identity than we do for ethnic origins and then for a race. But you can see all over 3.5 million. So it's a substantial amount of data. Now, this is the part that I wanted to point out. The people who are selecting prefer not to disclose. That is, they are not selecting one of the ordained options that they've been provided. It has remained relatively steady and much lower than we anticipated based on testing. In fact, the data above indicate the prefer not to disclose is substantially lower, only somewhere around 12% for gender identity and not quite 22% for race. During the schema testing, if you'll remember, the highlighted data I showed you is that it could be as high as 32% of people who said they wouldn't be comfortable. We spent a lot of time within the Joint Commitment thinking about how it is we can best communicate to assuage concerns that folks would have. And now our response rates are everything from 88 to 78%. And we think that this is really quite considerable. Sharing with Professor Morning a week before last, she was wildly impressed at how well we've been able to do this. The next set of slides that I'll show, and you'll just have them as reference, show what the actual data is. I don't think that there's anything surprising about it, but it really does tell us. And one of the things we learned is that it is more women than we had anticipated originally. And we also are able to look at the reporting across ethnic origins and across race and look at what are the most prominent. Finally, I just want to share with you, and you'll have these as hyperlinked information on where you can get information from last February, a really awesome article that the Joint Commitment Initiative was in, how the Joint Commitment diversity questions were developed. Then the press release between Aries editorial manager and Elsevier when we first introduced it, the FAQ site. There is a recording of the entire process and the schemas at the International Peer Review Congress keynote from this last September. And then you'll also find two of the other Joint Commitment members, RSC's Royal Society of Chemistry, their conveners, and Royal Society, that they also have FAQ pages that you can borrow from quite liberally if you're looking to do this at your own organization. With that, I will end my presentation and stop sharing. And we will get to the questions, I believe, all at the end, but I'll try my best to answer any in the chat in the meantime and turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Holly. We are going to go straight into Alex's presentation now, and I hope everyone's got the information from the chat, but just to note again for anyone who joined us later, this is being recorded and we will be sharing it out. So if you missed anything from Holly, it's all recorded, the slides will be shared, and she's always, always welcomes questions if there are follow-ups as well. Sorry, Alex, I'll pass over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. I am very happy to be here today. Thank you, CPARDISC and SSB for the invitation. I do apologize if you hear the occasional echo. I am staying in a room that is not very appropriate for webinar, but I do my best. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see. So this is the agenda for my talk today. First, I will be sharing some results of 2 surveys that we did with our editors. Then I will be sharing the current state of collecting demographic questions in Scholar1 and OJS, which are the 2 most used submission systems that we use at SciELO Brazil. So we did a survey, 2 surveys with the same sets of questions of the IA questions to our editors, one in 2020 and another in 2022. The first one, we got 300 results, and the second one, we got 313 results, and that's because between the first and the second one, we had more journals that joined our collection. There are two main goals for these surveys. First one was to check the scenario and see what the situation was about the IAA policies in our journals. But the second one was to raise awareness for this, because we noticed that in our journals, when we ask something to them, it actually make them think about it, and it plants a seed in their minds, and we notice that there is an effect of them really digesting what we are asking. So we asked two questions. First, we asked if they had any DIA policies at all, and if they just to check the territory, let's put it this way. And the second one was related to the pandemic in terms of increasing race and gender inequalities. So for the first question, here are the results. The first two, let's say, sub-questions or first two items we asked in terms of editorial board and reviewers' genders. So as you can see, most of our journals, well, not most, but not the majority, the biggest majority, it was slightly half of the answers did keep in mind gender in terms of editorial board and reviewers when selecting reviewers. And this is probably because they have more control over who the people that they are choosing for these roles. However, when we ask for, in terms of authors, both for invited papers and for accepted papers, if they had any consideration or if they were checking the gender, the majority of our journals answered that no, that they were not doing any checks. The second question related to the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic resulted in increased gender and race inequalities throughout research communication. And we asked our journals if they felt that same impact. And as you can see here by the green color, most of our journals answered that they don't monitor race and gender for the authors. So basically, these two questions were related to author submission. The 2022 survey results were very similar. I'm not even going to spend some time because the results were very similar. So there were not a lot of changes between those 2 years. So the biggest takeaway that we have, the conclusion that we took from these surveys is that our editors don't have enough tools to monitor demographics in their journals. So it's very difficult for them to answer such questions and to monitor that. So moving on, as I said, we use mainly two systems at SciELO Brazil. One is Scholar One. It is used by 48% of our journals. The demographic questions have been introduced in the July 2022 release, so it's less than a year since they have been introduced. And the first reporting tools will only be available by the end of this month. So up until now, we were not able to report on these questions. And we're not yet possible to evaluate the efficiency of such reports because they're not available yet, but they will be by the end of this month. The questions were created by a special committee, which I think was a very good thing. All SciELO journals are asking the questions, but the answer is optional. And one important fact that I wanted to mention is that up until now, the questions are only available in English, even though we do have journals that have Portuguese and Spanish configured in their Scholar One sites. So this is just some screenshots of the demographic questions. I'm sure several of you might be familiar with them. So they are asking one question about gender, another about race, and one about ethnic origins. So moving on now to OJS, the situation is very different. It is used by 45% of SciELO Brazil journals, so it's kind of half and half. Half of our journals using Scholar One and the other half using OJS. There used to be a binary gender question in OJS 2, but it's been removed since OJS 3 came out. And while I understand that the asking gender in a binary way is not the best approach, they haven't done anything in terms of improving or doing something that is more appropriate for asking this question. So demographic questions are not available, and they are not planned in the short, medium term either, as far as I'm aware. Country data is collected, which is a good thing, from all users, but reporting and cross-referencing those that data can be very challenging from our experience. There is a feature request open for voting in the PKP forum. I've pasted the link there, and there's a screenshot, which is basically asking for ways of showing the gender distribution and country distribution within a journal using OJS. So this is a good improvement. However, it's not planned yet. It's up for voting. So I noticed that no one answered in the chat that they use OJS and it wasn't in the pool. But if anyone's using OJS and would like to contribute to this, I would very much appreciate if you could cast your vote on this feature request. So for final thoughts, I am aware that I presented more challenges than solutions. This is the situation that we are facing right now with our journals. As Holly said, and everyone knows, I believe collecting and analyzing demographic data is very important for defining policies, strategies, and analyzing the state of your journal. Use of third-party tools, such as an external survey or external form that authors could fill out during submission or reviewers could fill out during the review. It is interesting, but can be very challenging and time-consuming, and sometimes they're not standardized. And I'm aware that some journals do very incredible things with those solutions or alternatives. However, in thinking about a bigger scale, it's not the best solution in my opinion. So ideally, demographic data should be collected in the submission platform following the EIA best practices. And with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to the discussions.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was really helpful and informative. We will be now passing over to Dan to present on AUP's experience. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Becs, and thank you for including me in this panel. Very excited to speak today. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Rogers. I am an editorial manager at Oxford University Press, USA, based out of New York. I'm going to talk today a little bit about OUP's earlier D&I efforts and how that led to our author survey, as well as some of the challenges that we faced leading up to the creation of our survey. Next slide, please. Thank you. OUP's US offices, we have had several employee-driven DEI subcommittees within our individual publishing groups since around 2016. These subcommittees are employee-led, and like I said, started around 2016 or so. In 2016, several departments organically created their own D&I groups. Our overarching goal across all of these groups is to publish a diverse array of authors, topics, perspectives by incorporating D&I into our commissioning of editors-in-chief, of editorial boards, etc., as well as factoring in diversity and inclusion into our internal hiring. Yeah, like I said, several employee-driven DEI subcommittees in our US offices. Some of the highlights in my group, the reference and content development subcommittee, some of our highlights include an editorial best practices guidelines, which we share internally with editors, which gives us all kind of a guide on diversity and how to factor in D&I into copy editing, commissioning, peer review, workflows, all of that. A gender balance tool, which actually was one of the very first projects that our D&I group undertook several years ago now. And the gender balance tool actually shows you kind of how far we've grown since these D&I groups initiated around 2016. Because this gender balance tool was internal editors can drop the names of, say, a list of authors that they're planning to commission into this gender balance tool. And this tool will populate and show you the breakdown between names that are historically assigned to men versus women. And obviously, one of the obvious setbacks with this gender balance tool is the lack of a non-binary category. And again, this shows you how far we've come with our D&I efforts because, we created this just to have some sort of initial guiding post for us to start planning D&I, factoring in D&I into our commissioning. And since then, obviously, we have taken this tool much further and implemented it into the author survey, which I'll talk about shortly. Additionally, some other highlights from our group include compilations of newly published diversity and inclusion related content that we've published, which marketing and sales then uses for sales and marketing purposes. We've also implemented hiring panels for entry-level positions in order to remove bias from the hiring process. And our event subcommittee produces several author talks and mixers and presentations and film screenings related to D&I. Our reference group's main goal was to think about DEI in our planning and factor it into our goals and the goals for our teams. In talking with a lot of our external editors-in-chief and our boards and our authors, we realized that we needed more data than we had in order to take our efforts to the next level. My group, which is the reference group at OUP, we've used the manuscript submission manager Scholar One, but that has had its limitations for us when it comes to getting useful and representative DEI demographics information that we would need from our authors. So some of the limitations for our group that Scholar One poses is the fact that data from Scholar One isn't automatically anonymous. For us, it requires a very lengthy process to anonymize data. And also the data from Scholar One isn't that reliable due to a lack of responses from authors who use Scholar One, as well as changing info from our authors. So say, for example, an author who changes institutions or moves, if they don't update their information in Scholar One, that data would obviously not be reflected. Also, the issue of how to pose the questions in Scholar One, how do we pose these questions without being insensitive or leading to any confusion or incorrect responses. And finally, Scholar One, we found that the data wasn't representative of all of our authors across all of our products, all of our formats, etc. And this is simply because in our reference department, as well as our research books team, not all of us use Scholar One for our products. Mostly the online, just a couple of the online products use Scholar One. And so if we really wanted to get a very accurate representation of all of our authors here at OUP, using Scholar One would only give us a very small snapshot of just a select group of authors. So yes, in our conversations with our editors-in-chief and our commissioning planning, we needed more data to make progress towards our DEI goals and to measure what success looks like, which is what led to our author data survey. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this author data survey's goal is to equip editorial teams with anonymous data that they can then use to identify areas where our author base does not reflect the diversity within the global research communities that we serve. Some more background on what went into the survey. So we partnered with our own OUP journals team. Holly on this call today worked with our group as well on planning this survey. We also partnered with internal D&I groups and an external organization called the Creative Diversity Network, which helped us to revise the questions, help us figure out the best way to ask our questions. And we developed an anonymous survey to collect demographic data from recently published and newly commissioned authors in our reference and research books programs. And it's important to note that we mostly, we focus the survey just on our research books and our reference authors. So obviously there are other divisions and functions at OEP, such as higher ed and other teams that also have authors, but for this purpose, for this survey, we focus on research and reference authors. So in January 2022 that's when we first sent this survey to authors who had published with us over the last 5 years. That was our baseline data set. And now this survey is now deployed on a regular basis as new authors are contracted. And just for a little more background on the internal origins of the survey, just because I think this is relevant to the conversation and the topic today, and to touch on a lot of the challenges that we faced. So our journals team here at OUP is a member of C4DISC, and recently the journals team worked with C4DISC and with Elsevier, including with Holly in this webinar today, to join the Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing. And through this, the journals team was able to create their own author survey. And we wanted, however, to dive a little bit deeper than the journal survey asked of our authors. And we realized that a lot of what they were able to capture from their surveys using systems like ScholarOne and Editorial Manager, like I said previously, we realized that we wouldn't really be able to capture the same accurate representation in our reference publishing. For journals, they were able to make their survey required to all ScholarOne users or all of their authors, meaning this survey wouldn't be opt-out. The reason that journals used for this was they thought that this not having an opt-out option would give them a better response rate to their questions. In our situation in research books and in reference, it was different given the number of different authors we had, all writing for different formats across different products, online, reference, books, as I mentioned earlier. Also, journals went through a very lengthy process with our internal compliance team to ensure that the data was anonymous. That data for them would then be going to a separate server, and the work involved in doing that was very lengthy and complicated. However, for journals, that process was worthwhile because, like I said, ScholarOne gives them a much better representation of their author base than ours would in reference. And so for the reasons I mentioned, and since we wanted to get a more nuanced view, we asked just a few more questions than our journals team did, using their questions as a base jumping off point. So some of the questions we read, or some of the questions we posed to our authors in our survey were asking about their discipline groups, whether or not they're humanities or sciences, and so on. We also asked, are you affiliated to an educational or academic institution? In which country are you currently based? What are your ethnic origins or ancestry? With which groups do you identify most closely? What was your age at the time of your most recent OUP publication? Which gender do you identify with? Do you identify as transgender? Do you consider yourself to have a disability or an impairment? And is English one of your first languages? Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay. So a little more background on the details of the survey. Like I said, a draft of this survey was piloted with about 60 contributors who were asked to indicate their level of comfort in responding to all of the questions we asked. After that first initial feedback, we revised the survey and then sent it to about 2,500 contributors to assess the completion rate and feedback. Finally, the finalized survey was sent to all remaining OUP research books and reference authors published in the last 5 years. This was about 20,000 people. So we received responses from over 1,900 people, which is about a 10% response rate, which is pretty good for this initial rollout. The results are statistically representative of the total sample with a 95% confidence level, and we allowed for about a 2% margin of error. We did change some of the questions we asked based on some of the initial feedback, such as leaving out a question on sexuality. For example, while sexuality is an important aspect of diversity, many respondents said that asking about their sexuality was too intrusive, and it isn't really a survey statistic on which we can easily act editorial editorially in order to improve the diversity of our author base. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on this slide, you'll see a sample response to one of our survey questions, which gender do you identify with? This slide isn't representative of the final survey or of future survey results, but this table is representative of the kind of data that we are looking for and how we plan to use this data to inform our publishing. So for example, in this slide here, you'll see that this question, we do ask our authors if they identify as man, woman, or non-binary or gender diverse or other. But for the sake of this slide, we're just showing the breakdown between male and woman. Because we're asking more than just a couple of questions, we can do some interesting analyses with the answers from our authors that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise with just a fewer questions, such as the chart on this screen shows, where we're cross-checking gender balance with the question we ask of where are you in your career stage or age range. And this gives us an idea of what the future academic community looks like. It gives us insight into where to focus regarding topical expansion, coverage, etc. So yeah, combining the answers to ethnic origins. Another example would be combining the answers to ethnic origins or ancestry with which group you identify with. That's another example of how we can combine answers to get kind of a more nuanced view of our author base. Okay, next slide. Okay, and finally, next steps with the survey. We only recently rolled out this survey. We are aiming to distribute the survey to authors every quarter. The next round of survey results should arrive this May. And once we have more data to go from, we plan to have our teams incorporate these survey results into content planning and into our commissioning and combining some of the answers as I just explained to help further our planning and future content planning. Some challenges that we faced with this survey are making sure that authors don't feel obligated or pressured to participate. That's something that's very important to us, and it's also why we didn't want to make the survey mandatory. Another challenge is that authors who don't answer the survey, that's an obvious example of that. We're missing some input from authors if they don't choose to answer. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the gender balance limitations regarding those who identify as non-binary. We do ask that question on our author survey now, but one of the challenges we face is making sure or trusting that all of that data is representative of the population and the academic community. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, another challenge we face is the changing demographics data regarding geography. So if an author moves and they don't take our survey the second time, a challenge is not having that updated information documented. So that is next slide, please. That is all I have for this presentation. Please feel free to ask me questions. If you'd like to email me, my email address is on screen. But otherwise, yeah, thank you. Back to you, Becs.
Thank you all so much. If all of the panelists could pop their videos back on, because the questions have been flowing in, and I'd like to get as much information out of you all as possible. So I have what is probably a quick question for you, Holly. There's been quite a few comments about when can we get this? When can we have all of these questions on our EM outside of Elsevier?
Okay, it's a great question. And first, look, there was simply practicality. Can't do everything all at once. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't break editorial manager and we didn't break any journals process. So we went with Elsevier first so that we could be responsible in partnership with Aries. The next up will be the Elsevier Society partners. And as I said, so we expect that to start and finish this coming quarter, so Q2. Then with regards to Aries and EM's other clients, We've been working really closely with Aries. I have a meeting that's coming up because we've had another large publisher ask the same question. As I understand it right now, the opportunity to be able to provide the same sort of schema with architecture to other clients is going to happen in Q3. There are another way. APA, for example, is an EM client of Aries, separate from Elsevier. We do have within that system a way to capture some data. What was determined is that the nature of this personal and sensitive personal data, there was best to have a separate architecture. And I didn't have a chance to show you, but that the diversity data is collected. The user thinks it's all within EM, and then the data is captured and shuttled to a different system with a different set of access constraints and roles relative to other data within EM, such as the standard name, et cetera. And then we're working on the ways of being able to combine it. So we're actually still working out the issues of the architecture behind the scenes. We think we're almost there. That is, if you capture the data, can you get it back out for reporting? We wanted to make sure that that's possible. We've run into some issues working with Aries and Elsevier and software engineers. So right now, I'm understanding that it's Q3, but I will happily follow up with my contacts at Aries and see if anything has changed. Our goal has always been to get that up and going for all of Aries clients as quickly as possible, but without breaking anything. So that's where we're at, and we are deeply committed on Elsevier's side to enable Aries to do that. Please know we are not aiming to advance some competitive advantage. That has never been our goal. Our CEO actually told us explicitly that shouldn't be. So feel free to follow up, and I will work for Aries to give explicit information out to all of its clients. Thanks for that, Becs, and sorry that I went maybe too long on that answer.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. I think you calling out the support of the CEO in particular on this is something I'd be kind of curious to follow up on. What for all of the panelists has been sort of the biggest point of resistance in terms of rolling out either survey instruments or data collection within the systems, both potentially from within your organizations or from sort of partners and editorial boards more broadly? Dan, you were nodding, so I'm going to go to you first.
Sure. Yeah, I think for us and for reasons I mentioned, I think because our teams all use different systems, some use Scholar One, some use Editorial Manager, some don't use systems like that at all. I think that's probably for us the biggest kind of obstacle. Is just, if we can, like I said, if we can get data for one project and one set of authors, that's great, but that doesn't tell us too much if that's only, a small portion of all of our authors. So that's what OEP faces, at least in my experience.
So it's more a systems implementation rather than a sort of organizational resistance.
Right. Yeah. And then obviously we have the kind of internal bureaucratic roadblocks, but I think that's anywhere, just getting things approved by compliance. I mentioned the survey having to be reviewed and be part of a lengthy process with our compliance team, and just making sure that we're not, not doing anything uncolored or inappropriate, right?
Yeah, Dan, I'll echo all of those, right? I don't know. It seems that the now 56 publishers, there were 11 when RSC first convened, but from the get-go, there was incredibly strong support from the heads of houses and commitment. It was really, the concern is about the implementation, right? Don't break the system so that journal manuscript submission and review can't go on. We did have one problem with one journal. We discovered it in the first hour of turning on the diversity questions. We're able to turn it off within 15 minutes of receiving the notice. And the team was able to restore functionality and then restore the questions, and it's been working ever since. So that's been the biggest part. Now, in my head, I was telling the organizers ahead of time, I freaked out at the beginning and had this true nightmare where everything failed miserably, and they made sure that the CEO personally fired me. So I think some of us were deeply anxious, but not because the CEO, Kamsal, was never concerned or felt that we shouldn't move forward. It was just really about, these are systems, and we're supporting so many journals. Let's not mess that up. The support, and from my perspective, that this is an industry-wide initiative, that the 56 participating publishers are not seeking competitive advantage in any individual publisher, but rather aiming collectively to have an impact on greater diversity, inclusion, and equity across multiple dimensions is extraordinary, and doing it in a way that's not taking anything away. It's really quite extraordinary the way the publishers have come together.
I completely agree. Alex, has that been your experience as well? Or have you got different sort of challenges or opportunities?
No, I agree 100% with my panel colleagues. In SciELO, the DEIA policies are now part of our criteria. It is part of SciELO's principle, so we don't have that political barrier anymore. We never really had. It's just it's been officially now it's been officially. Is publicly stated now in our criteria to enter the SciELO collection, but now we have to face, as Holly said, all the infrastructure and then as well all the technology barriers that we have to overcome. We also use multiple systems. We have a Scholar One in OJS, and there are also some other options that I didn't mention. They have small numbers, but they do exist. So we have to manage a way to collect those data in a leverage way, which is a big challenge.
Yeah, I want to add just another note about this too. And I saw that there was a question about the gender balance tool. I think for me, from my perspective, like I said, I've been involved in OUP's kind of grassroots D&I efforts since around 2016. Something that I found interesting is I've been at OUP for 10 years, and I think something that is potentially a challenge, but more of just something that I think keeps all of us on our toes, if anything, is kind of the changing nature of a lot of these questions and topics surrounding D&I. The gender balance tool is one example. So back when we first created this tool back, like I said, around 2016, the conversation around non-binary people and people who are gender fluid, that wasn't, at least here in the United States, that wasn't a topic that was as widespread and common as it is now. So that example, the gender balance tool, where even when we created this tool, we knew that it was obviously creating a binary, because people using this gender balance tool, like I said, you would drop in a list of, say you had 50 authors to commission, and you would drop those suggested names into this gender balance tool, and it would basically give you a percentage of, okay, so this list has 50% socially male names or historical male names versus female names versus could be applied to both genders, and obviously that's very gendered and binary. But to be honest, like I said, discussions around non-binary individuals and gender fluidity was not something that was even as mainstream as it is now, and that was only several years ago. So yeah, I think kind of keeping an eye on the changes and the progression within a lot of these conversations about D&I, that's something that I think poses some challenges and more conversations.
I think that speaks to one of the other questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions that have been asked. So if the panelists could take a bit of time to type in some answers to those that we were planning to answer live. But I think Hillary's question is a really great place to round up. We've got these incredibly rich data sources that are either online or, according to our earlier poll, are coming through for the majority of people working in scholarly publishing at this point. But what do you think is the most practical or impactful thing that we can actually do with that information once we've got it?
I can speak to what we are doing at Elsevier. So this data, we're already reporting at the overall stage aggregated. This has already meant that our journal's leadership team has set aspirational goals for where we would like to see representation at overall, beginning with gender identity. Later on this year, we anticipate sending similar goals with regards to race and ethnicity diversity as well. So that's at the senior levels. We're also then working right now on being able to do journal level reporting of this data, and it will be shared with the publishing directors and publishers, their editors-in-chief and senior editorial board members. We're going to also provide them with the benchmark data that's available from Elsevier's publicly available global gender report. I'll provide a link in a moment in the chat, and use that as benchmark data so that they can look at the community that their journal serves, look at the current composition in terms of diversity of their board, and then use that as a way to start discussion about greater diversity and inclusion, and also to set targets. These are not ones that will be imposed by Elsevier as the publishers. These will be decided, like lots of editorial decisions, by that editorial board. They'll just share it with us, but we've now created a way for every journal to begin this conversation and do so in a data-informed evidentiary way.
That's great. Alex and Dana, you're using this data yet in terms of decision making?
Yeah, so for us, like I said, we still plan to get several more survey responses in the future. But so far, yeah, I mean, historically, over the last several years, D&I has been factored into all of our goals. I factor it in with my team. It's factored into my goals, and this can be as as simple as when we have our conversations with our editors-in-chief, or when we sign up editors-in-chief, or sign up new projects or new disciplines within individual projects. In our conversations, we make it very explicit. To our editors-in-chief, we want to make sure that we factor in a balance between geographic representation, and then gender identity, and race, and everything. And then so I think just even having an open conversation with that with editors-in-chief and then commissioning editors goes pretty far. And I think most people are willing to talk about it and want to talk about it and want to see a change. So yeah, if anything, I think what we plan to use this data with in the future is to just color those conversations a little bit more, and then give concrete data. And yeah, if it's very obvious that we're lacking, author representation from one specific region in the country that we publish in, or that the discipline has a lot of activity in, then obviously we need to make strides to increase that coverage.
Yeah, very quickly, because I think we are at the hour. This data is very helpful to inform our policies and to define our political strategies. Right now, we already have in place one strategy that every SciELO journal needs to have at least 25% of the editorial board women, and 25% men, because we do have cases that 100% or almost 100% is composed of men, or the opposite. We also have it's very, very, there's one or two journals, it's a feminist journal that has 100% or close to that of women, and we also need to also treat specific cases, not this particular case, of course, but and we are aiming toward having a more equitable, in terms of gender, equitable editorial board. So this is just one of the strategies that we are looking at, but certainly those data can inform our journals to define their own policies and instruction to authors, and then with that, with the ultimate goal of having more inclusion in science communication.
I think that summarized that ultimate goal of having more inclusion in science communication is a fantastic point to end on. Thank you so much to all of the panelists, Holly, Dan and Alex. This has been a really rewarding and informative session. And to Steph and Megan for organising this, and to SSP and C4Disc for hosting. I've really appreciated it. I would like to ask any of the participants who are still here, we have one last poll to see sort of what next steps, so what from this session you would plan to bring back to your organisation. So if you could just take a moment to answer that question, I think that would be really helpful for us to know sort of what the next steps are, and if your next steps aren't on the multi-choice, please feel free to add it to the chat. We will be finishing the recording very shortly, but Holly has agreed for those who would like to stay on and who missed the beginning of her presentation, we would like to be able to facilitate that, and Holly's agreed to stay on and run through that, and to follow up with the people who missed that. So I think, oh my goodness, only 2 people are not ready to take active steps, and hopefully there's some learnings, at least from this, that you'll be able to take forward and have some kind of conversations or thoughts. That is a really promising set of answers to finish this up with. Thank you everyone so much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for joining us all today, and I will leave it to Susan to stop the recording. Thank everybody who will be leaving, and then we can move over to Holly's presentation to bring everything back together again. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.